The next talk is held by Steve Best. He is professor at the university, philosophy professor at the university in Texas, El Paso. He will talk today about the ecological and social crisis we are faced and how this will change how we act and how we need to act. Steve Best.
Thank you. Welcome. Good to see you. We live in an era of absolute planetary crisis that is rapidly worsening, and it portends profound social and environmental catastrophes. The future that was promised to us is dark, not bright. It is frightening, not inspiring, despite what the prophets of progress told us it would be. The perfect storm for catastrophe and social and environmental collapse is proceeding ahead rapidly due to the convergence of a number of factors, which I'm going to speak about today. These include population growth, globalization, modernization and industrialization, environmental degradation, and resource scarcity. Resource scarcity. At the same time, these other factors are unfolding and interacting. We now live in an absolute new geologic era in the history of the Earth. We lived for the last 10,000 years in what was called the Holocene era, the Holocene epoch. That's over. That ended with climate change. That ended when we became the dominant factor driving natural processes on this planet. They no longer drove us, we drove them. We are driving them. We now live in an era called the anthropogenic era, and there is wide consensus that this is a valid historical marking term. We live in the anthropogenic era that is characterized above all by climate change. To an important degree, the future is already loaded into the environment. It doesn't matter what we do at a certain point, although of course we must do all we can. It's preloaded. There already is a catastrophe waiting to unfold, no matter what we do now. The question is, will the future be bad or absolutely horrific? Will it be challenging or will it be impossible? The future is already loaded into the environment with climate change. Increasingly, violence and conflict and wars are erupting over deteriorating environmental conditions, over a lack of precious life resources. And these environmental conditions are anchored in social conditions. That's important to understand and emphasize. That what's happening to the environment is socially caused. And that relates to structures of inequality and structures of oppression. So we have to understand the environmental problems as social problems, which I'll proceed to do here. So there is a race to consume what's left. And on the one hand, we have global elites trying to control and manipulate the markets for the remaining supplies of water, oil, minerals, etc. And on the other hand, we have the dispossessed. We have the poor. We have the small farmers, the peasants, the indigenous peoples who are struggling to survive. And as it turns out, the people who contributed the least to climate change will suffer the most. So we are looking at a confluence of some really serious dynamics here that we really don't pay too much attention to in our movement, sadly enough. So I want to emphasize the current conditions of resource wars and climate change and environmental degradation and what this might mean for our movement and how we should pay a little bit closer attention to what's happening here. And the problems really begin with the development of a growth society, a growth and dominator society. That's what we live in now. That's what we built 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago is when we began agricultural society. And in the shift from hunting and gathering society to agricultural society, we began to manipulate and dominate the natural world to the extent our technologies would allow. We began to manipulate and dominate the natural world. We manipulated the genomes of animals, of plants, and we began to physically alter the natural environment. And we continued to do this up to this present day of bioengineering and genetic engineering, etc. So we began to dominate the natural world. We began to feel apart from it. We began to feel not a part of it, but apart from it, and as if it were something for us to manipulate for our purposes. Agricultural society is the framework from which the ideologies of anthropocentrism, or human domination over the earth, and speciesism, human domination over other species, these philosophies developed in the framework of agricultural society. They were possible within that framework. Agricultural society was a growth-oriented society. Capitalism is just an extension of what we began 10,000 years ago. Now, as we began to increase the food supply, we began to increase our populations. Now, Chris mentioned earlier the statistics on population, so this is for you, Chris. I want to give you these statistics as an indicator of the challenges that we're facing. At the beginning of agricultural society 10,000 years ago, there were 5 million people on this planet. We reached the 1 billion mark in 1800 with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. A century and a half later, just about, in 1945, we climbed to 2 billion. It didn't take us another 15 years to hit 3 billion people in 1960. And it took another 15 years only to top 4 billion people, which we reached in 1975. Now, we passed the 7 billion mark last year in 2012. We now have a planet of 7 billion people. We are adding 90 million people to the planet each year. And by the year 2025, it is predicted that our population will exceed 10 billion people. So imagine all the problems we have on the planet right now and what this means for animals, and add another 3 billion people. And factor in climate change and resource scarcity, and you start to get the picture that I want to paint for you. The expansion process in human history accelerated greatly with the rise of capitalist society. Because capitalist society is a growth-oriented society. It is a grow-or-die economy. You notice whenever there's a bump in the economic road, the markets freak out and everything starts to crash in society, and there's absolute social chaos. This society is fueled by growth, and it can survive only by growing and growing and growing. The problem is we can only grow so much before we completely overshoot natural limits, which we are well in the process of doing. It's a growth system that depletes not just any resource, but non-renewable resources. Arable or irrigable land, water, and oil, these kinds of things are really non-renewable. We're reaching the end of these resources, as I'll describe. This is also a global system. Beginning in the mid-20th century, capitalism was always a world system, but it became truly a global multinational system with the Bretton Woods Accord in 1945 and thereafter. And so we get institutions like NAFTA, like the World Bank, like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and all of these are designed to marketize the world. All of these institutions are designed for centralized control, the commodification of all resources on the planet, the exploitation of all people for labor and animals as resources for this same project, the marketization of the world directed by a centralized command in European centers, and new market regulations put into place, such as enforced by the World Bank and WTO, which override local laws, override national laws, such that whatever traditions a country might have can be overridden by international laws as barriers to free trade. That's why I say we have an international centralized capitalist system now that is driving things from way up on the top. And this system employs things like structural adjustments, which is a nice euphemism. You go into a country and the World Bank says, well, we'll give you a loan. The conditions of the loan are you have to hamstring your labor force. We're going to drive wages down. We're going to end all environmental restrictions, et cetera, and we'll give you your loan. And this is happening all throughout the world. This is the capitalist system of growth. This is a capitalist system of resource consumption and resource depletion that has no end until the natural world will end this for us. So, capitalism forgot some really important lessons that we learned from earlier in history. And that is that there are limits to growth and that there are limits to resources. The Enlightenment in the 18th century taught us that we were going to make progress in history, and we were going to make this through the development of science, technology, and capitalism. Those three factors are what drive change in society. Science, technology, and capitalism. And because capitalism is a system based on rapid change, we shattered all existing traditions. We put into play the new. As Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. We continually create and destroy and create and destroy. Traditions mean nothing really except market traditions, and we put everything new into play so that we can develop new markets around that. And there were some warning signs that this was not a viable strategy. Thomas Malthus, for instance, in the 19th century, wrote a book called An Essay on Population. This was a really important book that very few people know much about. And in this book, An Essay on Population, Malthus said to the Enlightenment dream of incessant progress for peace and prosperity for all, we were promised in the 18th century that this new world system would bring. Malthus said, wait a minute, there's a problem in the mathematics of this system. And that is that you have a rising population and you have a diminishing supply of resources. And when you put together rising population, diminishing supply of resources, you've got a problem. This system's going to crash. So Malthus warned us that the dreams of the Enlightenment were built on sand, that we cannot have infinite growth. We cannot have constant progress because we're going to outstrip our resources. And Malthus was writing when there were just about 1.5 billion people on the planet. Again, now we got over 7. So what is going to happen when we start to outstrip our resource base? Well, we're going to crash. This system is going to start to come down. And that's what we're facing right now, a Malthusian nightmare. Because Malthus says if you don't correct the system by choice, if you don't reduce your population and or reduce your consumption, the natural world will reduce it for you. Because nature tends to correct every ecological mistake. Nature is structured around harmony and balance. And when species overpopulate, nature will eradicate. Right? So whether through disease or famine or war, we will take care of the situation ourselves, or nature will handle this for us. We can either choose to reduce our populations and reduce our consumption. It doesn't seem like much is happening in that direction right now. So what we envision then is a future based on Malthus's nightmare. Famine, hunger, disease, warfare, and social collapse. Now, scarcity. Scarcity is a socially manufactured problem, really, up to a point. Gandhi said, for instance, that the earth has enough to supply human need, but not human greed. And the earth is a very fecund, giving, physical, complex, organized body of matter, right? It gives us really all that we need, up to a point. Up to a point. And so Gandhi was writing this, saying this, when the world's population was only 2 billion people. It's now over 7. Gandhi was writing this before mass consumer markets that developed throughout the world. And we now have this problem. We have a twofold problem. It's not only overpopulation, but it's rising consumption rates. So no one is paying much attention to what's happening in the developing world. The developing world is rapidly developing. China and India, above all, are enormous problems that we underestimate and we under-theorize. China has 1.6 billion people. India has 1.3 billion people. And they are becoming consumer nations. They are becoming westernized. They are climbing on the consumer bandwagon, and they are going to consume enormous amounts of resources that will pose enormous challenges for this planet and for all of us. Just to give you an example of the scope of the problem here. The United States is 5% of the world's population. We consume 25% of all resources on the planet. China's middle class right now is 300 million people. That is the current population of the United States. You've often heard the phrase, well, the planet cannot handle another United States. Guess what? There is 1, 2, 3 United States brewing in China. And then we have India, and we have Brazil, and we have Africa, all of which are developing, all of which are trying to consume more oil, more water, more resources, all of which are moving toward consumer markets and capitalist ideologies, all of which are shattering earlier traditions. So these things are happening right now, and this has to change our framework of thinking. The Earth has its limits, and we have exceeded them. In the 1970s, the concept of peak oil originated. No, actually it was in 1956, the concept of peak oil originated, and it is widely, there is a wide consensus that we have reached the age of peak oil. That any oil that we extract from the land now will not be cheap, it will not be plentiful, and we are going to get diminishing returns on our oil supply, while we're stuck in a paradigm of fossil fuel paradigm. And we have diminishing water tables, and we have diminishing food supplies, such that we are facing imminent levels of famine with the rise of China and other countries to massive consumer capitalist powers. Now, in this era of resource scarcity, we have resource wars. We have struggles over what's left. And these are breaking out all the time. We don't realize to what extent social conflicts are really conflicts over natural resources. We have clashes for oil amongst the world's great powers in the Persian and Arabian Gulfs, in the Caspian Sea, and in the South China Sea. To give you an example of what is at stake in the struggle for oil, in the 1970s, President Jimmy Carter in the U.S. developed something called the Carter Doctrine that is being enforced to this very day. The Carter Doctrine says that we as a country, the United States, will militarily intervene anywhere in the world to protect our oil supplies. That was the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine informed our invasion of Iraq twice, our invasion of Afghanistan today, and it conditions what Obama is trying to do with Syria right this moment. I mean, if you thought, what is the sense of Obama going in to bomb the Syrian people as a way of protecting them? Well, he's trying to use a leverage right now to gain control over Syria, which is in the Middle East, of course, which is very important for our oil reserves and our oil addiction, our fossil fuel addiction for the society. So that explains Obama's Syria policy. It explains everything he's done in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a scramble amongst the world powers like Russia, China, the United States to tap what's left, or to tap the oil supplies in the Arctic region. And here we have oil supplies which are opening thanks to climate change, and once we burn them, we will continue to accelerate climate change. There are battles over the Tigris and Euphrates River along the borders of Turkey and Syria and Iraq constantly. There are incessant struggles over the Jordan River by Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. 10 different countries are struggling for control over the Nile River in Africa. Every major river in India is a constant source of struggle and conflict and wars and rebellions and uprisings and intense repression. Poor and minority populations everywhere, including indigenous peoples, are struggling against globalization, social oppression, and environmental degradation. Some examples of this include in Brazil, the long-standing struggle against the Belo Monte Dam, which displaced 45,000 indigenous people so that Brazil could centralize the water control and take away resources from people. This is happening in India and Africa with dams. Dams are actually a weapon of mass destruction for indigenous peoples. In Nigeria, There have been battles against multinational corporations by tribal peoples who are exploiting their land and leaving an oil slick everywhere and ruining their ways of life and killing people. The struggles of the Ogani tribes against multinational corporations like Shell Oil were repressed severely, such that the Nigerian government killed 2,000 Ogani people and executed their leader in a public theater. In countries like Mexico, the Chiapas uprising, we fail to realize that these often have important environmental and resource scarcity components to them. The Chiapas rebellion started when the president of Mexico ended all land reform, and ranching interests became a dominant factor in Mexican agricultural policy, and they were protected. We often fail to realize that so-called ethnic conflicts are often driven by resource scarcity, environmental conditions. For instance, in Rwanda, we have a situation where the Hutu majority exploited ethnic tensions that pre-existed, but in order to dominate land policy, and so to create conditions of resource scarcity. They exploited ethnic conflicts in order to really affect an economic domination rather than to put into play a multi-ethnic democracy. Similarly, in Darfur, which we think was strictly about ethnic tensions and genocide and racial issues, the Darfur conflicts were actually triggered over a scarcity of resources, the struggle of resources in society that gets easily cloaked as nothing but ethnic divisions. Now, the problem of resource scarcity is going to be worsened by two factors. One, we have a global spike in meat demand, don't we? Even though meat consumption is dropping in certain European countries and the United States, it's spiking beyond any known limits that we could appreciate in this movement. We tend to be very optimistic that we're making progress as a vegan movement, but when you look at the global picture, you see there's a surge in meat consumption, and we all know that this demands an intensive use of resources. So this is going to make the problem of resource scarcity all the worse. And second, we have the problem of climate change. And we call it climate change, not global warming, because climate change is a multiplicity of factors. It involves not just heating up the planet, which certainly we are doing, the global average temperature. It's going to involve floods in some area, drought in other areas. It's going to involve superstorms. It's going to involve millions of economic refugees from low-lying inland areas that are going to be flooded over by rising sea levels. And the sea levels are going to rise by meters. We're going to see by 2050, certainly by the end of this century, the melting of all the ice caps, the rise of the sea levels, all these environmental refugees, and problems caused by drought, including starvation, and problems caused by the severe weather forces that we are about to face. Now, if you found those population statistics alarming, I want you to listen real close to this. Because here's the bottom line on climate change. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've raised the average temperature of this planet 1.8 degrees. 1.8 degrees. Now, the consensus among climate scientists like James Hansen of NASA, is that the absolute threshold point before we get runaway climate change that we cannot cope with, that there's nothing we can do but endure the force of the superstorms and the drought and the starvation and the migrations. There's nothing we can do. It'll just get worse and worse and worse. And by the way, the carbon we have put into the environment now will last for centuries. So we're talking about centuries problem before this could possibly, centuries long before we could possibly destabilize or stabilize the situation. The threshold point of climate change is 2 degrees centigrade. We have already risen the planet's average surface temperature 1.8 degrees. That means we're 0.2 of a point away from runaway climate change now. The fossil fuels that they have already set aside to burn will be burned. And we have to factor in what's called feedback loops. When the Arctic ice thaws and melts into the ocean will be able to absorb less carbon dioxide. All of these factors will start to accelerate climate change. And climate change is accelerating far beyond what some of the most pessimistic scientists believe possible. They are astonished by how rapidly climate change is accelerating. Another way of putting this is in terms of parts per million of carbon dioxide levels in the environment. And here the threshold point is not 2 degrees centigrade, which we're about to pass. The number is 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the environment. 350 million is considered the threshold point that we must not cross. Do you know where we are now in terms of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the environment? We're at 380. And some of the predictions say that by the end of this century, we will be up to 5 degrees centigrade beyond the Industrial Revolution. We will have heated this planet up since 1800 by 5 degrees centigrade. And I can only leave it to your imagination what that will entail in terms of struggle and suffering and conflict on this planet, and what that means for our cause and the kind of priorities that we're trying to set. To give you an idea of the challenge that we have to face here, to avert runaway climate change, we will have to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by at least 50% of the 1990 levels by 2025 and by zero to the end of the century. We're nowhere near accomplishing that mission. So let me make some concluding remarks, and then we'll have some discussion. There'll be time for discussion. As I say, we're in the throes of a deep natural and social crisis, social and natural crisis that we fail to appreciate. And the natural crisis is caused by social conditions. It is systems of power, oppression, of inequality that enable multinational corporations to gain control over the world's resources, that take away people's decision-making powers. It is the social institutions, the social structures, the capitalist system itself, by its very logic, that creates this environmental crisis that we find ourselves in. So we can never separate out the crises in society and the crises in nature. The crisis in nature is a crisis in society. It's a crisis in democracy. We will never resolve the environmental issue until we resolve the democratic issue, until we get people out of power that have only their own vested interest in mind and don't care about animals and the environment and future generations and the distribution, rational allocation of resources. They don't care. They're going to use it until it's over. They'll use it all up until there's nothing left. It reminds me of a story I saw one time with 5, 6 different whaling countries, Norway and Russia and others. And they were all competing to kill the last whales. You know, the whales are being depleted out of the ocean. So instead of saying, well, for future interests of our industry, we should stop here and let the whales repopulate. No, it's a race to get what's left. It's a race to get what's left now. And the people are being left out. People are being trampled by these gigantic multinational corporate powers and by corrupt states. So when we talk about climate change, we're not just talking about the disintegration of natural systems, of ecosystems. We are talking about the disintegration of societies. We are talking about societies overwhelmed by the problem of refugees, drought, starvation, the chaos caused by weather effects. We are talking about societies where people are stretched to their very capacity to survive. And we are talking about authoritarian states that will arise in order to impose control on this situation. We are talking about the collapse of societies. Ultimately, really, we're talking about the collapse of industrial society, the collapse of so-called civilization. This is what the primitivists wanted. Well, they might get it sooner than we think, because this industrial house of cards is starting to come down. It's starting to unravel. It is inherently unsustainable. It's just a question of time. So we arrive at a certain crucial historical crossroads in our evolution, really in the history of this planet, where what we do or what we fail to do will determine everything else in the future. And I mean now. I mean, the window of opportunity we have to work with here is just a few years, perhaps. I mean now. So we need a lot of change in this world. We need radical change. Reform won't cut it. Moderation won't cut it. It's an extreme situation. We need extreme change and extreme response. We certainly need a new technological paradigm. We need to move beyond the fossil fuel paradigm. How incredibly primitive is that? You know, we're supposed to be an advanced scientific technological society. We can do genetic engineering, but we are using our energy supplies based on mud in the ground that is built over been built over billions of years, and we are depleting in hundreds. And we think that it's always going to be there, or we can't make the change away from this paradigm that is destroying the planet as we know it. How insane is that? How primitive, if you will, is that? We need to shift to a totally different energy paradigm. We need to put that question of population back on the table. Because, damn it, I don't care if we're talking anymore about poor people or Western lifestyles. And, of course, the Western lifestyle has many magnitudes times impact on the planet, as do indigenous peoples or poor people. If you look in South Africa, for instance, it is poor farmers that are overcrowding the spaces of the elephants. It is poor farmers who are helping to drive the elephants into extinction. It's just the sheer number of people on the planet now. It's not just a lifestyle issue. Of course it's that, but it's also just a sheer number at a certain point. So we have to put depopulation on the table for this movement. And it's hard to talk about because it historically has been laden with racist overtones, and we have to avoid that. We have to be very sensitive to the racial traps that are embedded in that population question. But we have to reduce the world's population, and of course, the world's consumption levels have to go dramatically down. But what is happening? The converse: population is growing out of control. Consumption rates are spiraling. China. So, you know, the changes that we need to make are nowhere in sight. And it makes us wonder, you know, how can we possibly struggle against it? What is our possible future? We have this incredible challenge ahead of us. A challenge such that our species has never faced a challenge like this. A challenge we can barely wrap our minds around. And we are failing. 2009 at the Copenhagen Earth Summit, what happened? 2009, this wasn't the Rio de Janeiro summit when climate change models were not very exact and we didn't really know what we were facing. Now we do. They had no excuse in 2009. The scientists knew how serious the climate crisis was, and nothing happened in Copenhagen. There was no international binding treaty, only voluntary agreements to try to reduce emissions and to reduce emissions by various nations at levels far under what have to be reached. So we have an absolute historical failure like the Copenhagen Conference in 2009. What are corporations doing? Well, they are driving to consume the rest of the fossil fuels that they can. They are greenwashing the whole situation by talking about clean carbon and that kind of thing. It's like humane meat, right? Clean carbon. We have political corruption. In the United States, for instance, the oil and gas industries are incredibly powerful. Look at the Bush regime. Bush and Cheney were oil men. Well, how are you going to get any climate change legislation passed through that kind of regime? And it's still the same with Obama. It's controlled by the oil and gas lobbyists. That's why in the United States, we can't even get legislation passed to improve the gas mileage of cars. We can barely do that, let alone to shift to alternative technologies. Because the power system is structured around the dependence of fossil fuels, and its own survival is structured around that paradigm. So it's not going to commit suicide. So it's really it's not a technological problem we're looking at, it's a political problem. It's a political problem of how to break the grip of multinational corporations over political systems, over the choices that we have and the choices that we can make. The NGOs, the national government organizations, typically get co-opted, typically get bought out, typically become ineffectual, typically become just money-making machines. The public. Is the public aware of what's happening? Is the public intensely concerned about climate change and resource scarcity and the coming wars and the coming conflicts? No, the public is apathetic. The public is asleep, narcotized by mass media and by disinformation. Half the people in the United States don't even believe in climate change still. And what about our movements? What about the vegan and animal rights movements? Well, we know that the vegan and animal rights movement have a profound role in changing situations on this planet today. that veganism is very important for environment and the conservation of resources that are left. That veganism is very important in animal rights for the new ethic, the new worldview, the new mentality, the new spirit, if you will, of aligning ourselves on this planet away from the dominator paradigm that has prevailed for the last 10,000 years. Hell yes, veganism and animal rights are very important for economic change, for technological change, for environmental change, for moral, spiritual change. Hell yes. But let's not be too satisfied with ourselves, because we are not addressing the problem of climate change and population and resource scarcity and the coming conflicts of the 21st century over resources and over environmental degradation. We know about greenhouse warming, and we know the role that meat production plays in accelerating that. But we don't really confront the urgency of the issue. There is a complacency in this movement. There is a mentality that, well, we'll go vegan and it will be gradual change and, finally we'll overcome the meat paradigm and the dominator paradigm. How the hell is that going to happen when this house could fall down by 2050, by 2025? How much time do we got left, before we start acting more urgently? Before we realize that vegan education and handing out pamphlets is like trying to catch an ocean with a rain bucket. So we pay too little attention to this, and for those who are pacifists and have this rosy idea of people living in harmony on the planet, guess what? It's only going to get more intense. The struggles on this planet, if you pay attention to what's going on in the developing world, the struggles over water, the struggles over food, the struggles over land, from Chiapas to Africa, to Brazil, to India, there are struggles everywhere over diminishing resources. Conflicts are going to increase. Wars will become more intense. Russia, China, the United States, their interests are going to be pitted against one another. And the rational thing would be for us to come to international agreements. The rational thing would be for us to realize it's in all of our interests to reach agreements and to move out of this paradigm, the dominator paradigm, the fossil fuel paradigm, etc. But we're not very rational, are we? The powers that be are not very rational. And so it is going to depend upon the people. It's going to depend upon rebellions against this system. And so I'll pick up on Sunday from this last point that I think resistance is the oxygen of the future, and that the only chance we have left of averting runaway climate change, of averting global chaos around the struggle over scarce resources, is the degree to which we can develop social resistance movements against multinational power and against the prevailing paradigms of energy, of morality, and society. Thank you.